I'm not into relative relatedism. Most of these people are probably liberals and intolerant. Live and let live. Live and let live. I don't believe in attacking people because they don't agree with my belief. Like, these people are grown people, like grown ups, acting like children, doing stupid little things. Live and let live. A concerned mother sent me a brief note after I spoke on the new tolerance at a conference in her area. She wrote, I was at a wedding in Dallas recently, and most of the people were in their 20s, and I wanted to tell you that what you were talking about this morning in terms of tolerance was exactly what I experienced. All the young people there were fine people, very well educated, who not only had a great jobs with great futures, but were very kind, warm, loving people. And I said to my daughter, I want you to be very honest with me because I see something here today. I see that these are good, kind, wonderful people, intelligent people going places with their lives, and yet there are unmarried men and women who are living together and thinking nothing about it. They have absolutely no qualms about it, what is going on. My daughter is 24, and what she said to me shocked me. And she said, Mom, you don't understand. My generation is different from your generation. My generation is more tolerant. They say, let people live the way they want to live. We decide our own personal right and wrong and leave everybody else alone. Such views are not exception today, even among Christians, Christian kids. An intensive study revealed that the majority of kids, 50% in strong evangelical churches, already believe what the new tolerance is teaching, that what is wrong for one person is not necessarily wrong for someone else. And it is getting worse. Recent research indicates that while less than half of the people of retirement age today believe that there is no unchanging ethical standard of right and wrong, nearly 4 in 5 18 to 34-year-olds espouse that unbiblical view. It's clear that new tolerance is gaining growing acceptance among each new generation of young people. And if you are a parent today, your children may well be in imminent danger based on the research of adopting the dangerous doctrine of a new tolerance. Nor does the impact of this dangerous doctrine stop there, since new tolerance teaches that all beliefs, values, lifestyles, and truth claims are equal. It is not enough for you or your children to live and let live. It is not enough for you to assert an other person right to believe or say what he thinks is right. It is not enough to allow a person to disagree with what you believe or do. Exactly what I see. In order to be truly tolerant according to the new tolerance, you must agree that another person's position is just as valid as your own. In order to be truly tolerant, they say, you must give your approval, your endorsement, your sincere support to their beliefs and behaviors. No, I won't do that. Sorry. What does this do to your child's view of truth? It undermines the very essence and meaning of absolute truth. When your child embraces the notion that accepting others with different beliefs and lifestyle means to consider those beliefs and lifestyles equal, a notion of absolute truth, any idea that there is an objective right and wrong that applies to all people, all times and all places must necessarily fly out the window, so to speak. And any person who no longer believes in absolute truth or lose his or her moral compass his or her ability to distinguish between right and wrong. And a child or adult who cannot distinguish right from wrong will be powerless to resist temptation and choose right. This agenda of making all beliefs and behaviors equally valid and praiseworthy becomes clear if you listen closely to what the proponents of the New Tolerance say. For example, Dr. James Binks in his book, An Introduction to Multicultural Education writes, multicultural education is exclusive. A lot of people are on the margins of society because of their race, class, generation, or sexual orientation. Multicultural education is about bringing them to the center, making one nation from many people. To do that, we have to validate their experiences. And notice what that comment by Dr. Binks reveals. He talks about bringing people from the margins of society to the center, and he says that the way to do that is to validate their experiences. He suggests that it's not enough to accept people who are on the margins of society. We must also validate, that is, approve, endorse, legitimize their experiences. That means endorsing their values, beliefs, lifestyles, and truth claims, whether those involved in homosexuality, abortion, masculinity, or other behaviors that might be abhorrent to you and your children. In legalization, affecting the national endowments for the humanities and the art of the U.S. Congress has even declared the arts and the humanities reflect the high place accorded by the American people to the nation's rich cultural heritage. And to the fostering of mutual respect for the diverse beliefs and values of all persons and groups, italics added. Notice that Congress did not simply suggest respect for persons themselves, but their diverse beliefs and values, and add there that presumptively prescribes praise and endorsement for the reprehensible beliefs and values of the Ku Klux Klan, as well as for many worthwhile groups seeking to promote racial harmony and reconciliation. And the receipt policy adopted by the New York State Regents also reflects that New Tolerance demands for approval and endorsement of all values, beliefs, lifestyles, and truth and claims. Each student will develop the ability to understand, respect, and accept people of different races, sex, culture, heritage, national origin, religion, and political, economic, and social background, and the values, beliefs, and attitudes. American Federation of Teachers President Albert Shanker objected firmly to the stated educational policy. He wrote, "Do we really want students to respect and accept the values, beliefs, and attitudes of other people, no matter what they are? Do we want them to respect and accept the beliefs that led Chinese leaders to massacre the Tibetan students in Tiananmen Square? And what about the values and beliefs that allowed the Ayatollah Khomeini to pronounce a death sentence on Salman Rushdie? It is exposing unwanted children to the elements in certain deaths, a custom still widely practiced in some countries in Asia and Africa, to be respected and accepted because it is part of somebody else's culture." It is female circumcision. Must we respect the custom of forcing young children in the Philippines or Thailand to work in conditions of virtual slavery? And must we look respectfully on Hitler's belief and actions? Apparently so. John Leo, writing in the Washington Times, points out the bizarre results of a system that not only forbids criticism, but demands praise and approval for all values and belief lifestyles and truth and claims. In 30 years of college teaching, Prof. Robert Simon has never met a student who denied that the Holocaust happened. And what he sees increasingly, though, is worse, students who acknowledge the fact of the Holocaust, but can't bring themselves to say that killing millions of people is wrong. Simon, who teaches philosophy at Hamilton College, says that 10 to 20% of his students are reluctant to make journal judgments. in some cases even about the Holocaust. While these students may deplore what the Nazis did, their disapproval is expressed as a matter of taste, a personal preference, not moral judgment. Of course, I dislike the Nazis, one student told him, but who is to say they are morally wrong? Well, I won't bow down to their little agenda. They have what they believe, like everything's right, everything's valid when it's not. The new tolerance has created a climate in which people can no longer say that the systematic murder of 6 million men, women, and children is wrong. But the new tolerance demands for praise and approval does not only affect how you and your children think, it impacts will also be felt in how your children live. So, for example, in the infamous rainbow circumcision development in New York City schools, first grade teachers were instructed that they should be aware of varied family structures, how do you say that? Specifically, especially gay or lesbian homes, and that children must be taught to acknowledge the positive aspects of each type of household. John Leo, writing for the U.S. News and The World Report, pointed out that such teaching goals contributed to a new effort requiring approval and endorsement. This demand for praise and endorsement of other people's belief, values, and lifestyles was revealed by a Massachusetts college that required a Bible club leader to be open to the acceptance of homosexuality and all other religious belief before being permitted to lead the Bible club on campus. The college clearly believed that it was not enough for the Bible club leader to live and let live. It also demanded that the leader exhibited approval for unbiblical behavior and belief. Like the board, however, who will not rest until all enemies are assimilated, the proponents of the new tolerance will not stop at approval, but will press you, your children, your church, and your community until they gain your full participation. For example, Stanford University's Gay and Lesbian Alliance promotes a short stay in each spring during which people are exhorted to wear shorts to signal their support for the homosexual agenda. The event may have the added benefit, of course, of enlisting annoying participants who wear shorts on a particular day, not because they support the Gay and Lesbian Alliance, but because students at Stanford wear shorts practically every day. And similarly, one residence hall at University of Pennsylvania promotes a Gay Jeans Day, in which people are asked to show their support for gay civil rights by wearing jeans on that particular day. Given that 80% of college students these days wear jeans every day of the year, Richard Bernstein, the author of Dictatorship, A Virtue, questions how supporters of gay civil rights would be distinguished from those who wore jeans in that day because it was their usual practice, which is exactly the point, of course, because the goal of such promotion is to set things up so that the option of doing nothing of that participate in a political activity is effectively eliminated. Or consider the case of several Ohio hospital nurses whose superiors tried to force them to participate in a therapeutic abortion procedures despite the nurses' protests on religious grounds. Or the students of a California community college were called ignorant and told to leave their psychics class because they stated their belief in the significant evidence for creation. Or the hospital employees in Texas who was ordered to undergo psychoholiness because of her religious speech to one of her supervisors. Such actions reveal the agenda of the new tolerance, not simple acceptance of persons who are different or who believe or behave differently, but approval and participation in their attitudes and activities. As the boring mantra goes, resistance is futile. You will be assimilated, but take heart, there's hope. It is possible not only to understand, but also to expose and counter the indigenous agenda of the new tolerance. It is possible not only to keep your children from being assimilated, but also to instill within them a more excellent way, a way to accept others for who they are without compromising the truth. It is possible to follow a biblical, Christ-like response to a postmodern culture, as we will show in the chapters to come. The cost of tolerance. Mr. Johnson's eyes scanned the students in his humanities class. Okay, he said, back to our study of tolerance. Let's do a role play. Who wants to take the part of the atheist? Several hands shot up. Kimmery, he said. You be the atheist. Now, how about Baha? Anybody here familiar with Baha faith? One lone hand was raised in the back of the room. My older brother been into that for a while, explained a tall blonde kid in the last row. And Mr. Johnson nodded. Rani Baha. Okay, Buddhist? He turned toward Harold. Didn't you say something once about your grandparents being Buddhists? The young man nodded his affirmation, and Mr. Johnson went on. Let's see anyone here of the Jewish faith. No response. How about the Christian? Along with 3 others, Matt raised his hand. Okay, Matt, you're the Christian. That should do it. Let's get started. The 4 who had been chosen made their way to the front. Of the classroom as Mr. Johnson explained the situation for the role play. Here's the deal, he said. The 4 of you have been sent as, I don't know that word, delegates, delegates, to represent your particular religion at a conference on tolerance. Also represented at the conference are people, different lifestyles, and you are all 4 seated at a table together. When one other gentleman joins you, or play that part, got it? They nodded and took their places around a small table that had been set up in front of the room, and then Mr. Johnson sat down with them. Hello, he said, introducing himself. I'm Fred Johnson. I'm not here representing a religious group. I'm representing the local gay and lesbian rights group here in town, and I'm really excited. This conference should be a big boost to us, especially right now when we're trying to get the local ordinance passed. You know, the one that prevents landlords from discriminating against us by refusing to rent to homosexual and couples. The opposition says the ordinance isn't necessary since landlords rent to roommates of the same sex all the time. So who to know if we're gay or not? But that's just the point. We don't want to have to pretend we're straight just to be able to rent an apartment. I mean, I'm proud of who I am, aren't you? All 4 heads nodded in agreement as Mr. Johnson went on. So what do you think about it? I mean, representing your different religious points of view. What positions will you take toward us? Do you think we should have to pretend to be ashamed of who we are just so some intolerant bigot can control who does or doesn't live in his apartment? Kimmery was the first to answer, absolutely not. After all, what right does he have to say who can live somewhere and who can't? This is supposed to be a free country, isn't it? At least that's what it was founded on, freedom for everybody, no matter what we believe or do. As an atheist, I say we each have an equal rights to live wherever we want to live and to do whatever we want to do. And she glanced around the table at the others. If somebody else's so-called God says differently, I sure like to know why. And then Harry was the next to jump in. I don't know a whole lot about my family's religion, he said, but I do know this. Buddhists are very kind and gentle people, and they don't believe in violence or hatred. So there is no way we could reject you because of your lifestyle. No way. He shook his head in phrases. And Randy agreed, I feel the same way. The Baha'i faith teaches the unity of mankind, and that means equally right. Everybody's equal. The way we look, the way we live, the way we believe. Everything. Nobody has the right to tell us how to live or what to believe or who to love, especially based on what one person or group thinks is right or wrong. Mr. Johnson smiled. It's nice to know that I'm sitting with such an enlightening and loving group. But Matt, you didn't tell me how you felt about the situation, and I'm sure you, as a representation of the Christian religion, have an opinion. The group waited and started at Matt. He took a deep breath, and what would he say? What would you say? What would your children say? And what would happen if you or they disagreed with the others in the group? Remember, the goal of New Tolerance is not only to achieve acceptance of those persons who are different or who believe differently, but it is to force all others to approve of and participate in their attitudes and activities. But what about those who refuse to follow the Pied Piper of the New Tolerance? What happens to people who stop short of approving and participating in others' beliefs, behaviors, and lifestyles? Such people, including you, if you are a Christian, are likely to be branded as narrow-minded, bigots, fanatics, extremists, and hate mongers, and subjected to public humiliation and indoctrination. Take example of the RA resident hall assistant at Cornell University, a practicing Catholic who was forced to view hardcore pornographic movies of gay and lesbian acts as part of a sensitivity training session in orientation. This was not an R-rated performance. The young man pointed out the gay movie was really XXX. Not only was the Sunday training session mandatory, but the trainees were watched closely for any sign of revulsion that might indicate homophobia, which would presumably have brought further training or dismissal. Such people, including your children, if they try to stand for biblical standards of truth and morality, may find themselves centered and castigated like the 9-year-old boy in Virginia, whose summer enrichment program class was asked to respond to the question, what do you do when you're afraid? Another dark discussion leader told the boy that his answer was pray, was a nice response, but inappropriate, and therefore could not be added to the list with the other students' contributions. Such people, including their friends and fellow church members, may even be denied their First Amendment rights in the name of tolerance. They may be denied schooling, scholarships, employment, like the winner of the Miss Illinois pageant, whose scholarship money was withheld because she was a student of a Christian college. In short, those who don't play along in the game of New Tolerance are often made to pay, and dearly in many cases. As Apostle Peter warned, they think it strange that you do not plunge with them into the same flood of depredation, and they heap abuse on you. Exactly, yeah. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 4. But that's ridiculous. You may well protest. How can such crudity and injustice be carried out in the name of tolerance? How can people who preach tolerance be guilty of such intolerance? It's ridiculous. It's inconsistent. And well, yes and no. Such inconsistency seems totally illogical, unreasonable, unless you first understand something about the origins of this dangerous gospel of tolerance. So, understanding the times. My father used to say that a problem well defined is half solved. That is why it's so important to be like the men described it in 1 Chronicles 12, verse 32. The Bible says that these men of the tribe of Issachar understood the times and knew what Israel should do. We need to understand the times, the cultural atmosphere in which we live, because only then we can truly know what we are dealing with and how to respond effectively. The rise of the new tolerance corresponds with the general disappearance of the Ethiotheism in our culture. Ethiotheism is simply a fancy term for the belief that right and wrong are absolute, unchanging, and that they are decided and communicated to men and women by God. And this view of truth and morality form the basis for much of the Western civilization to date, as expressed in the American Declaration of Independence. We hold this truth to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What David F. Wells wrote about the prophets of the Old Testament and the apostles of the New Testament has been true for centuries in the Western thought and culture. They had a certainty about the existence, character, and purposes of God, a certainty about His truth that seems to have faded in the bright light of the modern world, and they were convinced that God's revelation, of which they were the vehicles and custodians, was true in absolute sense. It was not merely true to them. It was not merely true in any time. It was not true approximately what God had given. It was true universally, absolutely, enduringly. That, to paraphrase, What is that noise? They were convinced that God's revelation of which they were the vehicles and custodians was true. True in absolute sense. It was not merely true to them. It was not merely true in their time. It was not approximately. What God had given was true, universally, absolutely, and durably. That, to paraphrase Walker's Konakai, is the way it was, the way men and women fought, and what Western culture reflected. But that is no longer the case. Modernism is the view that gradually eclipsed ethiotheism, beginning way back in the Resistance period, roughly 1300, 1600, and proceeding through three other powerful periods and influences. The Resistance period began in Italy in the 1300s and over the course of the next 2 centuries spread throughout Europe, lasting through the 7th century. The Renaissance was characterized by great strides in literature, learning, art, and architecture. It also marked a significant shift in human thought, in contrast to the Middle Ages, in which the major theme of art, literature, and philosophy was glorifying and serving God. Resistance artists and thinkers exalted man and his abilities. The shift gave birth to a doctrine called humanism, which stressed human dignity and ability and regarded man as the center of all things, the master of his feet, the captain of his soul. And a reaches that led eventually to an unbiblical view of man and his relationship to his creator. As this way of thinking began to take hold, men and women dependent upon God as the source of truth and morality began to wane. The Enlightenment of the Age of Reason began in the 1600s and lasted through the next century, while the Renaissance and mind knowledge, God had many enlightened thinkers, such as Ronald and Deseret, claimed that if there was a God who had created the world, he had no contact with it now, which meant that men and women had to depend upon their powers of reasoning if they hoped to discern the truth. They could accept no help from God. Standards of right and wrong were not based on the nature and character of God. They were the products of human reasoning. The Industrial Revolution overlapped much of the Enlightenment period, extending from the 1700s through the 1800s. It was an explosive period of human productivity and advancement and inventions and innovations. In the premix of the industrial age, fuel more than factory furnaces, they stoked the fire of human confidence. The progress that men and women saw all around them encouraged them to look to themselves for hope and godliness. Man no longer felt the need to look upward to God. He need only to look inward to himself. That's what Dormism, the furnace of the Industrial Revolution. Still blazed hot when the theories of Charles Darwin, a former theological student, completed the systematic shift that the resistance had begun. Darwin's theories presented as an alternative to a theistic understanding of origins. God was no longer needed to explain or understand how the world and man came to be. The shift in thinking has succeeded in convincing men and women that they, not God, were the arbiters of truth and morality. Human accomplishments had made man ignorant, and confident in his own abilities to create good and judge evil, creating a way of thinking called modernism, which saw the world through the eyes of science. Modernism placed their faith in rationality, the ability of humans to understand their world. Empiricism, the belief that knowledge can only be gained through our senses, and in the application of rationality and empiricism through science and technology. In the eyes of modernism, any truth that could not be observed in the spirit, such as spiritual or moral truth, was relative. That is different from person to person. Sherry was echoing modernism thought when she told her mother in chapter 1, for you and dad living together before you got married, what happened wrong, but I don't feel the same way. That's what I wish you could understand. You have your value system, and I have mine. The fact that they're different doesn't mean one is right and the other's wrong. But just as theism has supplanted by modernism, modernism has begun to give way to another philosophy. Postmodernism between 1960 and 1990, writes Stanley G. Greens in the book of Printer Postmodernism. Postmodernism has emerged as a cultural phenomenon spurred on in many respects by the advent of the information age. Greens suggests that if the factory is symbol of the industrial age which produced modernism, the computer is the symbol of the information age, which parallels the spread of postmodernism. Postmodernism is complex, and its individual points are sometimes contrary. Still, a quick overview of postmodern beliefs might be summarized as follows. Truth does not exist in any objective sense. Instead of discovering truth in a mentalism, which is a story such as the Bible, or ideologically, such as Marxism, that presents a unified way of looking at philosophy, religion, art, and science. Postmodernism is characterized by incredulity toward materialism. Materialism. In other words, postmodernism rejects the idea that there exists any grand story that explains an individual, local story, or any universal truth by which to judge any single truth. Truth, whether in science, education, or religion, is created by a specific culture or community and is true only in and for that culture. Individual persons are the product of their culture. Individually is an illusion. Identity is contrasted from cultural sources. All thinking is a social construct. That is what you and I regard as truth are simply arbitrarily beliefs we have been conditioned to accept by our society, just as others have been conditioned to accept a completely different set of beliefs. Since human beings must use language in order to think or communicate, and words are arbitrary labels for things and ideas, there is no way to evaluate or criticize the ideas, facts, of truth. A language conveys. Table 1, an overview comparison of theism, modernism, and postmodernism. Theism, truth, has been revealed to men and women by God. Humans are both spiritual and material beings, created in God's image but fallen because of sin. The God is creator, preserver, and governor of his earth and has instructed humans to subdue it and care for it. Reason thought and language. Reason can disclose truth about reality, but faith and revelation are needed in addition. Human progress. Human history is not progressing, but awaiting deliverance. Any system or statement that claims to be objectively true or unfavorably judges the values, beliefs, lifestyle, and truth claims of another culture is a power play, an effort by one culture to dominate other cultures. For years, I puzzled over why, when artist Andrea Serrano exhibited a crucifix, a Christian symbol suspended in a jar of his urine, it was not only tolerated but was held as a work of art and funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. Yet to similarly display a homosexual symbol in a jar of urine would be considered intolerant and decried as a hate crime. Or why the City Hall of New Jersey can officially commemorate Ramadan, the Hindu New Year, Greek Independence Day, and Dominic flag raising day, among many, many others. But according to the ACLU, any federal court of appeals cannot display a manger scene at Christmas, or why Christian employees request to start a prayer group were repeatedly stalled by the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration when gay activist groups are not only allowed but encouraged by the agency. Such egoism toward Christianity is befuddling, particularly when it's perpetrated in the guise of so-called tolerance. But now that we know the basic tenets of New Tolerance, we can begin to understand why Christianity and Christians will be, in fact, must be, the target of the New Tolerance. For example, remember Chuck's conversation with his neighbor Jim in Chapter 2? The two men seemed to be speaking two different languages, which in a way they were, because Chuck was operating according to traditional tolerance, while Jim was defending the New Tolerance. When Chuck said, "I didn't say I couldn't accept them as people. I just don't agree with their lifestyle," he was viewing the homosexual agenda from the perspective of traditional tolerance, but that approach was intolerant to Jim. Jim argued because their lifestyle represents who they are, that exchange between the two men points out a basic premise of postmodernism and the New Tolerance. There is no difference between who a person is and that person's beliefs, behavior, culture, or lifestyle. If it were written as an equation, it would look like this: who am I equals what I do. According to the New Tolerance, who am I is inseparable from what I do and think and believe. My identity is wrapped up in my culture and conduct. Therefore, if you express any disagreement with my belief, you are disparaging me. And if you say that my behavior is wrong, you're judging me. If you criticize my culture, you're criticizing me. If you can't accept my lifestyle, you're being intolerant of me. The French politician Edward Pisani says intolerance is not simply the lack of a sense of solidarity with other people. It is the rejection of others for what they are, for what they do, for what they think, and eventually simply because they exist. Do you see what he is saying? He admits no possibility of accepting and respecting a person without approving and endorsing what he does and what he thinks. One educator has recognized the attitude among his students. He writes, "For the past 2 years, I have asked my students to complete surveys questions, and one such question is, can a person's belief or values be criticized without being critical of the person, without attacking a person's integrity and character? Invariably, the vast majority of the students answer no. In the space open for optional comments, many students elaborate on their no answers. What I believe can't be separated from who I am. And to criticize what's importance to someone is to criticize that person. So it says, this attitude was reflected recently by a pastor of a church that welcomes practicing homosexuals and has ordained a homosexual deacon. And when his domination considers several ties with the church, the pastor said gays and lesbians and their families are damaged, once again by hearing that God hates them. Responding to the observation that Christians should love their sinner but hates the sin, he added, they homosexuals hear that the way an African American would hear, love the soul and hate the color, or a woman would hear love the woman but hate the gender. Do you see what that person was saying? He equated who a person is and with what a person does, and he recognized no distinction between a homosexual person and homosexual behavior, and as a result came to the conclusion that said, in effect, if you don't approve of a person's lifestyle, you don't love that person. According to the definition of traditional tolerance, a person can reject another person's lifestyle and still love and accept them. Love and accept that person as one created in the image of God, one who is deserving of respect. Scripture does not teach that what we do constitutes the whole of who we are. The Bible says that God created man in his own image. Male and female, he created them. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. He created human beings as individuals made in his own image and with his own hands. Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. Not just as products of their cultures and communities. Our beliefs and behaviors affect us. Of course, Isaiah wrote, your iniquities have separated you from God, Isaiah chapter 59, verse 2. But his words show a clear distinction between who we are and what we do. In this case, our iniquities. But praise God that we do is not the same as who we are. For otherwise, God in Christ could not have separated our sin from us and thrown them into the sea of his forgetfulness. Micah chapter 7, verse 18, verse 19. But because the new tolerance works from the false assumption that what I do represents who I am, to accept and respect someone, you must approve and endorse that person's belief, values, and lifestyle. And if when you don't, you are considered insensitive, intolerant, and bigoted. This is the assumption underlying the words of British philosopher R.M. Hare, who defines tolerance as a readiness to respect other people's ideas as if they were your own. Hare's idea of respect does not mean an attitude that says, I love you, I respect you, but I disagree with your ideas. It means an attitude that says, your ideas are just as valid as my own. Because in the lexicon of the new tolerance, respecting me means accepting and approving my ideas. Because what I believe represents who I am. In other words, if you do not respect my values, my beliefs, my claim, truth, my lifestyle as much as you do your own, then you are intolerant because you're making a value judgment on my beliefs. And that, according to the new tolerance, is a judgment of me as a person. In a postmodern society, a society that regards our values, beliefs, lifestyles, and truth claims as equally valid, there can be only one universal virtue, tolerance. And if tolerance is the cardinal virtue, the sole absolute, then there can be only one evil, intolerance. And that is exactly the attitude we see among the proponents of the new tolerance. Dr. Frederick W. Hill, a school administrator, said, "It is the mission of public schools not to tolerate intolerance." Leslie Armour, a philosophy professor at the University of Illinois, proposed, "Our idea is that to be a virtuous citizen is to be one who tolerates everything except intolerance. But what does it mean to be intolerant according to such people?" According to the United States Nations Declaration of Principles on Tolerance, the tolerance involves the rejection of dogmatism and absolutism. Ironic, isn't it, that the proponents of the new tolerance are so dogmatic about dogmatism and so absolute in their opposition to absolutism. Perhaps it's appropriate, however, since they are also intolerant toward intolerance, as author Riser Lecter puts it in his essay, "The Trouble with Toleration." All those who cherish the value of diversity must perceive those, even merely considering the subjection of the plurality of ideas to selection in hierarchy organization to be intolerant. In other words, any system or individual that believes dogmatically in anything, and especially in absolute truth, is by definition guilty of intolerance. You don't even have to say anything if you do not reject the idea that some beliefs and behaviors are right and that others are wrong, for all people, for all places, and for all times. Then you are intolerant, and thus you are an appropriate object of intolerance. If you or your church or your children make any negative judgments about other point of views, you will be targeted. That is why the proponents of the new tolerance have no problem being intolerant toward Christians, Christianity, and Christian morality, because those things present problems for the new tolerance in four basic areas. Biblical truth. The truth claims and commands of the Bible are considered too narrow by today's definition of tolerance. Christians' belief in a God of truth, Isaiah chapter 65, verse 16, and in the book of truth, Daniel chapter 10, verse 21, is intolerable to the proponents of the new tolerance who consider a belief in absolute truth to be evil and offensive. Such attitudes create an idea climate for innocence like the following. In Massa, Virginia, 10-year-old Andre Pearson began taking her Bible with her to help pass the time on her hour-long bus ride to school. The principal said she could not bring her Bible to school. Jesus and the Cross. The claim of Jesus and the message of the cross are in front of today's definition of tolerance. Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." John chapter 14, verse 6. The new tolerance sees such a claim as intolerably narrow and exclusory, which helps to explain such contrast as that which occurred recently when the city of San Jose erected a 5,000 statue of the culture and acid god, while less than 100 miles away, a 103-foot cross in a San Francisco park was determined to be unconstitutional and was slated for destruction. Such an apparent contradiction is permitted because the acid god represents just one religion among many, while the cross represents the exclusive claims of Jesus and is therefore a symbol of intolerance, which also explains why, as mentioned earlier in this chapter, Andre Serrano's crucifix suspended in a jar of urine is considered art, while similar treatment of gay symbol would be intolerance, because the cross represents the exclusive and intolerant claims of Jesus, and such intolerance must be met with intolerance. Jesus told his disciples, the world hates me because I testify what it does is evil. John chapter 7 or 7. Things have not changed much in the 20th centuries, which is why today any suggestion that all have sinned, Romans chapter 3 verse 23, and that all have need of a Savior represents an intolerable association according to the New Tolerance, which is based upon the belief that sin is at most a cultural concept. One cannot be applied to everyone, and this explains the decision of the British Columbia College of Teachers, the BCCT, to deny accreditation to Trinity Western University, TWU, and force the school's Christian school education students to finish their degrees at a secular institution. Central to BCCT's decision was one paragraph in TWU's Community Standards contract. The contract requires students to refrain from various activities including involvement in the occult and sexual sins, such as premarital sex, adultery, or homosexual behavior. Leading the charge against the TWU accreditation, according to Vancouver's Christian Info newspaper, was College Council member Annabelle Paxton. Christian Info reported that Paxton, a self-declared lesbian, took exception to mentioning dishonesty, the caught in homosexual behavior in the same sentence. In a letter to TWU, the BCCT expressed its belief that proposed program following discrimination practices which are contrary to the public interest and public policy. An election of new tolerance for a religious institution to call homosexual behavior a sin is judgmental and discriminatory because it implies that all beliefs, behaviors, and lifestyles are not equal, and as such invites retaliation. The mission of the church itself likewise represents an intolerable challenge to the new tolerance. Jesus commanded his followers to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and of the Holy Spirit. Matthew chapter 28 verse 19. An intolerable mission that the new tolerance necessary defines as a fanatical effort to impose upon and dominate other cultures and other viewpoints. Stanford University student Scott Scruggs relates recently Dean of Stanford University began to pressure evangelical Christian groups on campus to stop the practice of proselytizing other students. Ironically, what angered the dean was not the content of the message that was being shared, but the practice of sharing itself. He believes that in approaching someone with the gospel, you're implying that person's belief or inferior to your own. Such an implication is unacceptable because it is self-righteous, BS, and intolerant. And of course, the dean did not consider it BS or intolerant for him to proselytize the Christian students to his root of tolerance because, in so doing, he was simply stamping out the evil of intolerance. And nevertheless, his warning illustrates how Christians have become a target of the new tolerance, because any effort to evangelize, which is the mission of the church, is an affront, because it implies that the Christian gospel is better or more true than all other ideas or religions. And that view, of course, cannot be tolerated by those who espouse the new tolerance. In fact, the nations of Brazil and Guatemala have both made it illegal for Christians to share the gospel with Native Indians, a position that has been supported and enforced by the United States nations. The new temple of tolerance. The effect of all is twofold. First, in the active sense, the new tolerance cannot be other than a fierce opponent of Christ, Christianity, and Christians. James Wood writes, the problem of tolerance has been called, in the words of Gasa Mechi, one of the great and most urgent challenging now confronting our world, the nation taken by the United Nations General Assembly, 25 November. In 1981, in adopting the Declaration of Elimination of all forms of intolerance and of discrimination based on religion or belief, while long overdue, with an important step taken by the family of nations. The elimination of all forms of intolerance by the family of nations were necessary to target those of us with a message of universal truth. We in the family of God will increasingly find ourselves at odds with the family of nations. But why should that surprise us? Jesus said the world hated him. He warned them it would hate us. It would hate us also, as long as we continue to proclaim the same absolute, exclusive message that Christ proclaimed when he walked the earth. We can expect to encounter increased persecution and tribulation in the world. See John chapter 16, verse 33. And even more so as the new tolerance continues to gain acceptance, which helps explain why Don Argue, former president of the National Association of Evangelicals, can say, the tragic fact of that Christians have become the special target of religious persecution in the world today. Second, in a more passive sense, the new tolerance serves as a modern temple of adultery, like the Gyanani, the Mandapan on the south side of the city of Madras in India. Carved on several of the pillars are figures of symbols of the various religions of Christian crucifix, a meditating Buddha, a Hindu god, a Islamic, calligraphically from Quran, and on a corner pillar are the words of the Mahatma. I came to the conclusion long ago that all religions were true, and also that all had some error in them, and that whilst I hold my own, I should hold others as dear as Hinduism. Gandhi's words, of course, pose a fatal problem, but the more pertinent point is that the temple of tolerance, like the Gandhi, Mandapan, shelters any in all religions except those that espouse absolute standards of truth and morality. Like Christianity, Orthodox, Judaism, Islam, the new tolerance becomes a gleaming temple for idols of every shape and size, which seduce you, especially your children, by means of a deceptive and dangerous cycle. The first step leading to this temple of tolerance is the undermining of a person's faith in the living God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This can happen as your child is ridiculed or intimidated because of his faith, for example, or persecuted for praying to God, or told that everyone's beliefs are equal to his own. Little by little, day after day, a once strong faith in God can be eroded. Once a person is thus induced to doubt that one true God, he or she loses the true standard for the right and wrong, which is the nature and character of God himself. If her children, for example, no longer believe strongly in the God of the Bible, they are not likely to turn to him, whom they doubt, for moral guidance. Instead of comparing their actions and attitudes to God and his revelation, they were turned inward, looking to themselves for moral guidance, and so doing stumble into adultery. That is as pernicious as it's prevalent, one that dates back to the back of dawn of time itself, to the Garden of Eden, when Eve succumbed the temptation to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Genesis chapter 3. She made an appropriate, important decision, one that has affected generation after generation of her race. She knew that God has already decided and communicated what was right and what was wrong, and he had clearly said, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die. Genesis chapter 2, verse 16, verse 17. But Eve decided that wasn't good enough for her. Enticed by the serpent, she determined that she wasn't going to let God tell her what was good and what was bad. She would make that decision herself. The evil one questioned God's word and tempted her with a promise that she would be like, knowing good and evil. Genesis chapter 3, verse 5. As a Christian apologist and author, Rabbi Zaris points out when she and her husband questioned the reality of his voice and supplanted it with their own authority, they made themselves the measure of all things. They set themselves up in God's place and took something that belonged only to God, the power to decide what is good and what is evil. The adultery is the second step leading into the temple of tolerance. It is an adultery that says, in effect, I will be my own God. I will determine what is right or wrong, what is true or false, what is good or evil. It is the same adultery that ruined the king of Babylon, whom some consider a type of Satan, who said, I will ascend in heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of the most heights of the sacred mountain. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Isaiah chapter 14, verse 13, verse 14. Once you or your child is enticed this far, this next step into the temple of tolerance, doing what is right in his or her own eyes, is nearly unavoidable, for it is only natural. When a person replaces God's revelation of right and wrong with a custom-made personalized right and wrong, to put that principle into practice as the faith of a child or adult is undermined, causing him or her to look inside instead up to God for moral guidance and begin doing what is right in her or her own eyes. The final step becomes unavoidable. If the testimony of the Bible and of our own experience teaches us anything, it is that when we do what is right in our own eyes, we will become susceptible to dangerous beliefs like the New Age ideas, and to the destructive behaviors like sexual immorality and substance abuse. The cycle is complete then for a person who is engaged in sinful beliefs and behaviors, or very likely feel distant and even alienated from God. And the erosion of faith that began the cycle will perpetrate itself, but there is an effective biblical way to counter this destructive new tolerance, and it will explore it in detail. First, however, we need to fully grasp the implications of tolerance in its individualist tactics. So yeah, I'm going to read the rest tomorrow.